In 1982, when Faith Church was just being formed, our founding pastor, Bob Helms, went out to try and visit a guy that he knew that he had been trying to tell about Jesus. He went to this guy's house and he knocked on the door and nobody answered, but he could see that the light was on in the workshop behind the house. And so he went around back to the workshop, and there he found not the man he was looking for, but that man's brother. And he struck up a conversation with that man's brother, and he felt the Lord leading him to share the gospel with him, and so he did. That man's name was Benny Higgs. Benny was there working in his brother's shop, and Bob Helms came by and shared the gospel with him. And though Benny had gone to church when he was a boy, he'd never heard the gospel. He'd always heard that he needed to be a good person, that he needed to follow the golden rule, that he needed to be a good guy, and he'd tried to live his life that way. But that night he heard that it was impossible for him to live in such a way to be worthy of God's glory and his righteousness. That it was only through Jesus and Jesus' forgiveness that he could be made righteous. That night changed Benny's life. He came to be a part of Faith Church in those early days, and he was a faithful member until his death in 2018. Benny, when he came to know the Lord, and it changed his life so dramatically, he wanted everyone in our community to know about it. And so he would tell people about Jesus. He would invite them to church so they could hear the gospel. And something that he noticed is that a lot of people didn't think of our building here on 5th Street as a church. They thought of it as a school. Because at that time, this building housed a Christian school. And so most people thought of this place not as Faith Church, but as Faith School. Benny was a sheet metal worker. And so something he decided to do that he felt would help distinguish this building, not just as a school, but also as a church, he went back into his shop and he built the steeple that's on top of our building to this day. He wanted people to know that this was his church, that this was the place where he'd heard the gospel message, that it wasn't just a building, it wasn't a school, it was his church. When I came in 2005, I learned as pastor then what Benny had experienced is that most people didn't know of us, didn't know of our church. In fact, pretty early on, a woman who was trying to pay us a compliment said, "You guys are the best kept secret in Chandler." And I appreciated the spirit of what she was trying to say. She was paying us a compliment, but I was thinking, I don't want to be a secret. Because Jesus called us to be like a city set on a hill, so that people could see the light from miles around. In those days, I would tell people I was the pastor of Faith Church, and they would then ask me about 5 other Faith churches in the area. Faith Church in Boonville? No, not that one. Faith Church of the Nazarene in Evansville? No, not that one. Oh, the Assembly of Faith Church? No, not that one. Faith Bible Church? No, not that one. Faith Church in Chandler. And they go, "Oh, Chandler. Chandler, yeah. Are you guys the church next to the bank?" "No, not the net church next to the bank." "Oh, are you guys the church on the highway?" "No, we're not on the highway." "Are you guys the church by the park?" "No, that's the Nazarene Church." "Well, where are you guys?" "We're on 5th Street in Chandler. You have to turn off the highway. We're like a block in." I found it very difficult to build a church that no one knew existed. It was very difficult to build a church that was the best kept secret. So we worked really hard to make Faith Church stand out. We entered local parades, we organized and held large events, and suddenly people started to say, "Oh, you guys are that church where the guy wore that crazy suit in the Christmas parade," or "You're that church that had that Star Wars event." And I could say, "Yes, we are that church. We're that church." But after a while, I found that as though it was helpful to be distinguished from all the other faith churches in the area and all of the churches in Chandler, while it was helpful for people to have some idea of who we were and where we were located, I learned that even when people know of your church, it's incredibly difficult to build a church. What I learned is that even if your church is known, I'm unable to build a church. And it was then that Matthew 16 became so very important to me and to our church. Let's read it together. We'll start reading Matthew 16 and verse 13. Jesus is walking with his disciples. They have entered into Caesarea, and he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" Verse 13, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they, the disciples, said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And by the way, this is the most important question that you can answer personally. Doesn't matter what Pastor Daniel says about Jesus. Doesn't matter what the world thinks about Jesus. Doesn't matter what your grandma thinks about Jesus. There's going to come a day and a time where Jesus is going to ask you, "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter speaks up. He's always the one to speak. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. This time it's pretty great. Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." The word Christ there means Messiah or anointed one. And Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Peter, you got it. It's so right. That clearly this was God who made it clear to you. And I say also to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And hearing that in the English language, it doesn't make any sense for him to say, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." But Peter means stone. He's saying, "You're Peter, you're like a rock, you're a stone, and on this rock I will build my church." Jesus is making a play on words. But we should be clear, he's not saying, "I'm going to build the church on you, Peter." Peter is not the bedrock of the church. He's saying, "I will build my church upon this bedrock of truth, what you have said, that I am the Messiah, the Son of the living God. On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, the gates of hell, shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. Do you know the mission statement of Faith Church? If you do, I encourage you to say it aloud with me. We are building the church our friends and neighbors will join and our children will lead. That's our mission statement, and we'll talk more about our mission next Sunday in Matthew 28. But this week we're talking about our vision. And it might be to you, those sound really similar. What's the difference between vision and mission? It might be that you're here and you're like, "This is just a bunch of corporate speak, Pastor Daniel. I don't really care about this. I hear about this kind of stuff at my office job or my factory job." Well, I think it's helpful for us to recognize, because mission is what we do, and vision is where we are going. Mission is what we do today. Vision is where we hope to be tomorrow. How many of you have ever been on a road trip? All of us, right? And nobody goes on a road trip because they just really love spending 8 hours in the car with their family, right? You might love that the first hour, but you definitely don't love it the 8th hour. But you're on that mission and you're in that car because of the destination you're headed to, the place that you are going. When you go on that road trip, when you go on that vacation, whether you take a plane, a train, you go in a car, you walk, your destination is what you have in mind. It's the vision, it's the picture of where you're headed. It's the future, it's the goal. And in Matthew 16, Jesus is talking to the disciples about the future. He's talking to them about what's going to come, what's going to happen, what's ahead. He's telling them about a church that he will build. And he's speaking in future sense. He says, "Upon this rock I will build my church." If you read the following verses, you'll see that Jesus tells them not to tell anyone yet that he is the Christ. It isn't time yet. Jesus is on a mission, but it isn't time yet for that vision. The vision is still future. Jesus doesn't want the disciples telling everyone that he is the Christ yet, because there's something important that must happen first. It's his crucifixion and then his resurrection. And after that, he lifts off that command and they tell everyone. They couldn't tell anyone, but now they're telling everyone. What we see in Matthew 16 is that Jesus is laying out this vision for the disciples, and he's laying out the vision for the church that he will build. You see, only Christ can accomplish this mission, and only Christ can fulfill this vision. Only Christ can build his church. And our vision at Faith Church is not to be that church that's simply known because we're in parades, or that church that's simply known because we have a preeminent location or incredible branding. Our vision is to be that church that Jesus spoke of in Matthew 16 when he says, I will build my church. Now, when Jesus says this, 2,000 years ago in Caesarea, he is not thinking exclusively and specifically of Faith Church in Chandler, Indiana in 2023. He's thinking of his church that has existed every day ever since he ascended, ever since he called his disciples to go and to make disciples. And ever since then, though there have been famines and plagues and wars, though the church has been persecuted, though people have attempted to burn all of the Bibles in existence, there has always been God's group of people who are on his mission and accomplishing his vision. And today, we simply want to be a part of that vision that Jesus had. That dream, that goal, that picture. Our vision is to be that church that Christ is building. And because our vision is to be the church that Christ builds, to be that church, we must be established on the foundation of Christ as Messiah. Jesus says, upon this truth, upon this rock, upon this foundation, I will build my church. A vision is a picture we carry in our minds. It's what we see. It's for this reason that when someone wants you to go somewhere on a vacation, well, the thing they do is they show you pictures. They show you a glimpse. I like what Ryan Wakefield said. He said, imagine you were hired to be in charge of the tourism board of Niagara Falls. And so you hired people that could write just beautiful, elegant descriptions of waterfalls. You hired people to catalog all of the hotels and restaurants that are in the area. And you put together this website, and you put together this brochure, and you took it to your bosses, the people who had hired you to promote Niagara Falls. And when you handed it to them and you showed them the website, it was only then that you realized you never hired a photographer to take a picture of Niagara Falls. You wouldn't be the head of marketing for very long. Because you've got to show people, you've got to help them see the reason that they should come to Niagara Falls. And when we have a clear picture of who it is that God has called us to be, when we've got a clear vision of who it is that God has called our church to be, we'll know where it is that we need to go. And we'll continue on the mission, we'll continue on the road trip, even when it's hard. I've been on some road trips with my family, and I love my family. I love my family. But 10 hours into a 12-hour car trip to Virginia Beach, I love them a little bit less maybe. And at that point, it's like, we're so close. We're so close. We're almost there. We're going to talk about the mission of Faith Church next week. And let me tell you, it's not easy. But when we have a clear vision of what it is that God is calling us to do, what it is that He is calling us to be, we can go forward on the mission because we have this vision. Our vision is not based on a great photo of what the future will look like. Our vision is based upon a person. Our vision is founded upon Jesus. Now, if I consulted with some church growth consultants, they would have told me that what I need to do this morning is I need to paint you this incredible picture of our church after it's grown, and we have this new building, and we have these incredible programs, and we're able to do this and that. And you know, that might work because it compels some people. But that's not what we're trying to build. We're not trying to build an impressive church. We're not trying to build an impressive organization or an impressive building. We're not trying to build a crowd. Listen, we can build buildings and we can build crowds, but only Jesus can build his church. And that's what we're doing. We're building his church. That's what we're about. Listen, the last thing I want when I come to the end of my days as pastor, when it finally comes time for someone else to take on this role, the last thing I want is for anybody to think of this as Daniel's church, because that will not last. That will come and go. I heard a pastor recently, he was on the stage with this kind of preeminent speaker, this guy who preaches lots of revivals, lots of really big meetings. He's standing on the stage and he says, "Hey, do you see that guy in the front row right there?" The pastor said, "Yeah." And the speaker said, "That's one of my converts." And the pastor said, "Well, that's awesome." And the speaker said, "No, it's not. Because he's one of my converts. He's not one of the Lord's. He's a fan of me. He's not a fan of Jesus." We're not trying to build Faith Church. We're not trying to build a platform. We're not trying to build followers of us, our brand, any of that. What we're trying to build is a church, and only Christ can build that. And so if that's what's going to happen, if we're going to be the church that Christ builds, we must have the foundation that he lays out here. And when he is the foundation, that'll clarify who the master is. Peter says, "You're the Son of God. You are the Christ." And that word means Messiah. And all the other names that people had listed off, when Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am?" There's some pretty noble names. Hey, some people think you're John the Baptist. Some think you're Jeremiah. Some think you're one of the prophets. That's great company to be in. But Jesus isn't any of that. He is the Messiah, which means the promised one. You're the one. Everyone else in the list of names was someone who was pointing to the one. Jesus isn't one more guy pointing to the one. He is the one. He is the Messiah. And when we recognize who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God, the one who was promised by all the prophets before him, when we recognize who Jesus is, it clarifies for us who this is all about. It's not about us. It's not about Daniel. It's not about you. It's about Jesus. It's about him. And when we have that clarity, it becomes clear what we should be about. When we have that clarity, it becomes clear who we're working for, who we're serving, who's called us on this mission. John Galbraith was this eminent economist. He served multiple presidents many years ago. And the story is told that one afternoon, President Lyndon B. Johnson called. He wanted to speak with Galbraith about the economy and some decisions that they were thinking about making there at the White House. And when Lyndon Johnson called, the maid answered the phone. And she informed the president, "Well, Mr. Galbraith is asleep. He's napping." And Johnson said, "Well, ma'am, I'm the president, so wake him up." And the maid said, "Sir, respectfully, I work for Mr. Galbraith. I'll let him know you called. Have a great day," and hung up. She was clear on who she worked for. Listen, there are a lot of people who have an agenda for the church. There are a lot of people that have their ideas about what the church should be. There are people even in our own congregation that think our church should be this or that. There are people in our community that think our church should do this or that. The only person who has say and authority is Jesus. He is the master. We are to follow his calling, his leading. Jesus is the master. And when we recognize that he is the master, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks for our church. It only matters what Jesus wants for our church. And what Jesus wants is a church that pushes against the darkness. What Jesus wants is a church that the gates of hell will not prevail against. I think it's pretty clear what it is that we are to be doing. We're to be pushing against the darkness, pushing against the work of hell, pushing against the violence, against the souls of people all around us. We're to be that city set upon a hill. We're to be proclaiming to everyone that Jesus is the Son of God. And there's a lot of good and noble work that we can be about, but there is one thing that is most important, and that is the proclamation that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. He is the one who came to take away the sins of the world. He is the one that can restore the brokenness in our hearts. He is the one who can change our lives. Because he's the master, he dictates the message. Peter says, you're the Messiah. And that word doesn't mean a whole lot to you and me. The Christ. But for a people who've been waiting for the arrival of the Messiah, of the Christ, for hundreds of years, it meant a lot. It meant a whole lot. He's the one they've been waiting for. He's the one they've been hoping for. It means that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the Scriptures, that Jesus had come to accomplish what no one else had been able to. You see, throughout the Old Testament, God had given them laws. From the very beginning, there had been rules for them to keep, and they weren't able to keep any of them. They were constantly making a mess. They were constantly breaking the rules. And so the people would make more rules, right? That's what we do, right? When something's broken, we make more laws. That's what our government does, right? There's a problem, let's make more rules. This will fix it. And it just makes it more and more complicated, more and more difficult to do the right thing. And by the time Jesus arrives on the scene, there were so many laws that the people couldn't keep them all straight. They had laws about what you could and couldn't do on Sunday, and what you could do at this hour and what you couldn't do at this hour. Nobody's able to keep all of these rules. And even when there was only one rule, the people weren't able to keep the one rule. But Jesus shows up, and he fulfills all of the law. He is perfect in every way. And he is the righteousness that we are not able to attain. No matter how clear and detailed the commands had been, the people had not been able to keep them. But Jesus does. And he makes it possible for us to be forgiven of all of the rules we've broken. Makes it possible for us to be righteous in spite of the fact that we've broken so many laws. He shows up. And suddenly there's a way. There's a way that we can be transformed. He shows up and lives are changed. He shows up and people who have been hopeless now have hope. Jesus is the master. He is the leader. He is the authority, but he is also the message. It's him. He is the truth. He is the answer. He is the one who can change lives. And this is so important. Because if we're not careful, we'll be tempted into offering people something other than Jesus, or we'll offer them something like Jesus plus this. We have this message of Jesus, but there's this new thinking about this, and we'll tack that on. We'll package Jesus in this new, different, exciting way. You know what people need? They need Jesus. They don't need our new spin on Jesus. They don't need our new packaging of Jesus. They need Jesus. And when Jesus works in their lives, a difference is made. And the gates of hell cannot prevail against that. When Jesus commends Peter, what is it he says to him? He says, "Blessed are you, Simon Peter, son of Jonas, because flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven." Peter, this isn't some really clever thinking on your part. This is God speaking through you. People don't need our opinion. They need the message of God. They need the truth of God. Jesus says God in heaven has revealed it, and the word there means to uncover. Listen, Faith Church, our job is not to be artists who create something. We're more like miners. There's beauty. We simply uncover it and show it. We just find the truth that is there. That's the reason that every Sunday when we gather together, we're not here to hear what Pastor Daniel has to say. We're here to hear what God's Word has to say. I do my job best when I am out of the way and I'm revealing and uncovering what is in this text, what God has to say, the message of God. Listen, if you walk away from church thinking, I did a great job, I've failed, you need to walk away from church knowing that God has spoken to you, that God has worked in your heart. And that's so important because I can't convert you, I can't change you, I can't make you different. Only God can do that. Just as only Jesus can build His church, only Jesus can transform lives. It is only the truth of heaven revealed that makes the difference. This is not a message cooked up by man, but it is delivered by God Himself. We're simply revealing the truth. In that moment, God chooses Peter to be the vessel that He communicates this truth through. And God, in His wisdom and His sovereignty, has chosen the church to be the vessel that He communicates His truth through. But the very best vessel, the very best communication of His truth does not alter it in any way, just reveals it, just declares it, just proclaims it. When we recognize that Jesus is the foundation of our church, it makes it clear who the Master is, makes it clear what our message is to be, and makes it clear where the muscle comes from. Only Jesus can build His church. Only He can accomplish it. How is it possible to build a church? Pastor Dan, you've already talked about the fact that it's hard. Listen, it is so hard. It is so hard. Now, 2 years ago, when I was considering opening a business, I talked to multiple people who had opened a similar business. And they said, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. I've never done anything so hard. It'll be the hardest thing you ever do. And I talked to Kevin Bass, who used to be here at our church and has gone on to serve in other churches and plant a church. And he happens to know multiple people who have opened up businesses similar to mine. I wanted to hear what he had to say, what he thought. If he thought I could open this business, he said, I told him, listen, I've talked to all these guys. They said it's the hardest thing they've ever done. He said, yeah, Daniel, that's because they've never worked in a church. He said, this won't be the hardest thing you've ever done because I've seen you as a pastor. And I know how hard that is. This work that we do, the work of building the church, it's so hard. We're trying to convince people to want what they desperately need. And we're not working against and wrestling with markets and bottom lines and budgets and spreadsheets. What Scripture says, we are wrestling against spiritual powers and darkness. We're not wrestling against flesh and blood. We're engaged in spiritual warfare. And listen, you and I are not up to the task, but King Jesus is. He is. I'm unable to save anyone. I'm unable to change anyone's life, but Jesus does it every day. And that's why I'm not interested in building a building or building a crowd. I'm interested in what only Christ can do. Building a church. Alan Platt points out that we often fail to do what we are called to do because we are afraid it won't work. When we see the work of building the church, we see the work of reaching our community, it seems like, I don't think it's going to work. But when we recognize that Christ is building His church, we see that Christ is at work in the lives of people. That before we ever even show up on the scene, God was already at work in them and pointing out in their heart this need for something more, that they were created for something more. We're coming and we're just delivering the truth that they have been searching for. Christ does that. There have been so many examples in our world recently of the gates of hell prevailing against churches. So many examples of churches fading into non-existence, closing, splitting, fighting, corruption. And that's not a proof that this passage is wrong. It's a demonstration that those are churches Christ was not building. It's a demonstration of where people attempted to build it in their own strength and their own power, or for their own glory. That's not what we want, and that's not what we're about. That's not the vision we're after. We're seeking for God to build His church, for Christ to build His church, and for that to happen, for there to be that power and authority that Jesus speaks of here, it's got to be something more than our efforts or our cleverness. It must be the Holy Spirit. It must be the power of God. It must be what people refer to as favor, as revival, as anointing, as awakening. It must be God showing up and doing what only God can do. That's our vision, to be that church that Christ is building, that church that when you see what God is doing, it's clear it must be God. It can't be us. It must be God. It can't be explained by a good location or talented people or slick programming or good marketing. It can only be explained by the power of Jesus. Only He could accomplish it. We often fail to do what we are called to do because we're afraid it won't work. But we're not called to do it. We're called to be His vessels as He does it, as He accomplishes it. Our vision, our prayer, our hope, our desire is to be that church that He builds. We are that church. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.